Hello, and welcome to the Turning Facilities into High-Performing Assets and How to Pay for It webinar put on by the Environmental Stewardship, Utilities, and Sustainability community. As a reminder, you have all been put in listen-only mode, and we will have questions and answers available for you throughout. You can submit a question through the chat or the questions portal, or raise your hand, and we will have a moment within the presentation for you to address those, or for us to address those for you. This is being recorded. The handouts for the slides are available in the panel to the right of your screen if you're logged on. If you're not, it will be sent tomorrow after this presentation. I'll hand things over to Dean. Take it away.
Well, good morning. Thanks for joining, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Dean Stanberry, and I'm the chair of the Environmental Stewardship community, and we strive to put on webinars and FMJ articles and other events throughout the year to support the community. I'm excited today about the presentation that we have. It's regarding funding in environmental or energy efficiency projects. And that's always been a bit of a challenge for facility managers, but there's some new opportunities out there. Next slide, April. Before we dive into that, I just wanted to highlight a couple of other webinars that are coming up. These are both put on by the Department of Energy with their Better Buildings Challenge. So April 25th, they have Advanced Energy Design for K-12 school buildings. Anybody who works in education, this is probably a good webinar to participate in. And then later, May 10th, they have Implementing Energy Savings Performance Contract Projects. So this is usually in conjunction with energy services companies, but the Department of Energy is also promoting rebates and other opportunities to get the cost down for these energy projects as much as possible. Next slide, April. So today we have our webinar on turning your facilities into high-performing assets. This was also an article that was in the most recent FMJ publication, and we're following up with the webinar to kind of add a little embellishment to it. It's going to help you understand some of the financing options that are available today and to fund these energy projects, and what's the advantages and constraints for each of the options, and more importantly, how to sell these projects. Our biggest issues are often, how to present the information in a meaningful way to the C-suite so that they can make good decisions around it. So today we have Danny Roberts, who's a senior associate with CleanFund, and CleanFund is one of the premier lenders in the PACE or CPACE program, which you'll learn more about here. And so I'm just going to turn it back over to April, who is going to let Danny take the reins and go on from there. Thank you.
All righty, Danny, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Dean, for the introduction. Thank you, April, for organizing. Just a little bit of background on how we got here. CleanFund is a partner of Abraxas's. We work on the financing side of the energy assessment and retrofit projects that Abraxas consults for building owners for. And we together collaborated on an article for IFMA around this topic, turning your facilities into high performance assets. So figured we'd do a follow-up webinar to kind of dive a little bit deeper, as well as obviously answer any questions you guys have. So here's just a really brief agenda. Just going to kind of give you a roadmap of where we're going, start out with an introduction, continue on with challenges that facilities managers face, give you an overview of the financial landscape, a couple of case studies that CleanFund has done with commercial PACE financing and working with facilities managers and different types of projects that it's been utilized for. And then, as Dean mentioned, selling your vision, communicating value, what are the sort of salient points that you can focus on to do that? And then takeaways, and I think, we'll leave adequate time, 15, 20 minutes, hopefully, for some Q&A. So as Dean mentioned, I've been working at CleanFund for about 3 years now. Started with a background as an analyst in a venture capital company, then moved on to Next Gen Climate, and then have worked at Clean Tech Open as well. And I think as Dean touched on a little bit, and we'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation, CleanFund is a nation leader in commercial PACE financing, which is really designed to fund energy-related building improvements through a unique financial mechanism that has been around for a long time, but is a relatively new spin on an old product, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. So I just wanted to start, with a sort of a personal anecdote that I think will resonate with you all facilities managers. Facilities management is a tough job. You've got a lot of opinions to balance. Knowing myself, some of them are probably pretty strong opinions. I've never worked as a facilities manager, but I know Stuart, our facilities manager, pretty well, and I can tell you that Stuart deals with a lot of building challenges, not least of which is CleanFund. Most recently, Stuart has helped project manage our ductwork, a chiller overhaul, and a roof reshingling just in the last 4 months or so. So, he's had his hands full in working with the owner, coordinating efforts, working with subcontractors and the like. And, these projects are all big challenges. They're not to sort of be undertaken. They require a vision, a project champion, project management, expectation setting, etc. I wanted to kind of first set the stage in terms of what challenges exist, what challenges facilities managers face, and how they're perceived by all the relevant parties. I think it's important to note that a lot of the challenges, broadly speaking, are similar throughout all buildings. So you guys are probably facing a lot of the same things that your community is facing as well. So while no one building is the same, they certainly all have the same issues and solutions. So some challenges relating to building efficiency obviously are, thinking about power bills and water bills and how to control these costs in an environment where utility prices in places like California, which is where CleanFund operates primarily, are increasing year over year, 3, 4, 5, depending on the type of asset, could be 6. We've even seen 12%. So how can you control those costs? Challenges related to tenant comfort, right? Things like adequately working HVAC systems, lighting, even cleanliness, and then resilience, seismic, storm strengthening, whether it be out of necessity, like in California, we have the seismic mandate. In Florida, I know they have storm resiliency projects that they need to do under mandate, or, a building owner might do that out of the kindness of their heart. You never know. So as I mentioned, while the building challenges might be the same or similar across a large sample of buildings and facilities managers' perspectives, how these challenges are perceived and by whom probably vary quite a bit. And it's important to note, what are the underlying components of each challenge? Where does sort of the thought process eliminate for each party involved in the transaction? Understanding these perspectives helps your pitch, whether it be to a tenant, a landlord, a vendor, etc. So lining these perspectives up with challenges, I'll just quickly run through these, right? So from a tenant perspective, they want to undergo these challenges in order to maybe build out a TI space or something like that, or have utility savings if they're under a triple net lease basis, for example, where they are incentivized to lower their utility expenditures month over month to the greatest extent possible, or for sustainability reasons, right? Or for comfort. As seen by ownership, what are the perspectives? Positively impacting NOI to increase your sale value as much as possible. Increasing building performance, attract and retain tenants, keeping up with building codes, like I mentioned in California and Florida. Some of the toughest in the country. And then facilities managers, what are your guys' perspectives? It's your job, right? You're responsible and accountable for the facility, for the owner, and for the people in it. So there's a lot of different things to juggle. Now, what are the measures? I just threw this slide in here kind of to juxtapose it with the next slide, which you'll see in a moment. But the point is that there are a ton of building systems out there to solve your problems. Now, I'm not a facilities manager, but I would imagine that one of these problems, it's probably most difficult to wade through the noise, really, to determine exactly what exists out there that you need to accomplish, and that is specific to the challenge that you're facing. And while there are a ton of options for building efficiency, right? You know, water conservation, resiliency, and energy efficiency are the largest categories. There probably aren't as many options in terms of how to pay for these systems. From my perspective, that makes for an interesting dynamic because you have mandatory building codes, you have needy tenants, you have a bottom line minded building owner, but not a huge amount of innovative ways to pay for what you're looking for. So moving on to the next slide, how do we pay? What are the financing options and how do they stack up? I think, you know, there are a ton of more known financing options for different types of building improvements. A lot of these have been around for a long time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of them. And then there are a few options that are a little bit newer, a little bit more esoteric, and are really taking a mainstay in the larger financing arena. So I'm just going to quickly run through these and kind of do it in the context of, you know, who's the driving force? Is it you, the facilities manager? Is it the tenant? Or is it the owner? And each driving force has different implications for the financing options. So we'll start with the capital expenditure budget. So capital expenditure budgets are basically allocations of capital that companies set aside to pay for necessary building improvements. Typically, it's going to be larger projects, right? So things like a large new roof installation or a central plant upgrade. So one of the positives, obviously, of capital expenditure budget is that you're not taking on additional debt. So you're preserving your debt carrying capacity and you're not putting yourself at risk of not being able to service the debt. One of the primary negatives that I've noticed in speaking with building owners and facilities managers is that it's sort of inherently, I wrote, introspective by design, which means that typically you and the people that you're working with that have sort of an inherent interest in operating the building most efficiently are the ones running the risk analysis of the project. So you're not necessarily getting outside perspectives. Of course, there can be, you know, a myriad of different parties involved in a capital expenditure budget, and it depends on a capital expenditure budget decision-making process, and it depends on sort of how your company is formed, what's the type of building and asset that you're working on, et cetera. But generally speaking, it's, you know, just something to keep in mind. Moving on to ESCOs, and this is actually something that Dean noted earlier, that IFMA is doing a webinar on May 10th on energy services performance contracts. So ESCOs are really the group behind energy services performance contracts. And an ESCO is essentially an energy efficiency consulting firm that goes into a building and identifies typically deep retrofit options in terms of how the building can reduce and then produce energy. So a typical ESCO structure, although they vary quite widely, would be one in which an energy savings performance contract is entered into with the building owner, and effectively the building owner is paying for the improvements that the ESCO installed through the accrued savings, and those savings are agreed upon in the contract. So everything is very set in stone prior to the project commencing. And I just outlined some quick positives and negatives of each of these. You know, project risk reduction, ESCO expertise, project limitations, and that typically speaking, you're never going to see an ESCO project below $500,000. I haven't seen one, but that's not to say that they don't exist. But you're talking about working with some of the bigger companies like Johnson Controls, for example. They're going to be working primarily on, you know, $1 million plus projects and then long project development cycles. And I think this is common. I'm sure you can all attest to that. Energy retrofits take a long time, and ESCOs, because there's this notion of an energy savings performance contract required prior to the project lifting off, it can also become quite time intensive to get that contract locked into place. So moving on, equipment leases, you know, we're all vaguely familiar in one way, shape, or form with equipment leases. If you lease your car, for example, it's not incredibly different from what a mechanical equipment lease might look for. Typically, you're going to utilize a mechanical equipment lease for something with longer useful lifespans. So the Most general example would be for HVAC equipment, for example. Positives of this: cash flow flexibility, efficient use of tax benefits. Think, for example, like a PPA structure. Limited security interest and difficulty to repurpose collateral are negatives. On-bill financing. In Colorado, I believe there are some on-bill financing options. In Southern California, there are quite a few on-bill and on-bill repayment financing options. They vary quite widely depending on who the utility is and what the improvement is that you're trying to install. I think the most positive benefit of an OBR is that it allows for a streamlined approach because the customer is already paying the utility for the power that they're utilizing. And so by installing some sort of energy efficient component and then adding the cost of that to the bill while getting it financed up front by a third party, you're effectively streamlining sort of the mechanism by which you're applying the energy improvements. So it's a little bit, it's going to be from a project development life cycle as compared to an ESCO, for example, it's going to be quite a bit quicker to accomplish this. We actually just recently were competing against an OBR contract on a small solar, and I believe it was a mechanical equipment project. And, the interest rates are effectively zero on these types of contracts. So it's hard to compete with that. So the newest one that I wanted to dive into is commercial PACE. Commercial PACE is and has been around since about 2007. It is a public-private partnership that allows private capital providers like CleanFund to provide capital for energy-related building improvements through a public means, which is the property's tax bill. So before kind of running through the positives and negatives of this, I'm going to give you a little bit of a backdrop on what commercial PACE looks like and how it functions. So the foundational concept of commercial PACE is that tax assessments or special assessments, which have historically for over 100 years been used for infrastructural improvements that are in the public interest, things like schools and roads, can now be utilized for improvements that reduce the built environment's reliance on the grid and thereby reduce the carbon footprint of a specific building. Because, the underlying, again, foundational concept is that that is in the public interest, reducing carbon emissions. So as I said, it's been around since about 2007. And I will say, it's a pretty new paradigm shift to get people to enter into voluntarily increase their property taxes. As you can imagine, the industry is in its relative infancy. It's been around for 10 or 11 years or so, and it's our job to educate the marketplace and do things like this. PACE has achieved strong growth. This slide is actually a little bit dated in terms of program activation. I think we're up to about 36 states right now with somewhere around 50 or 55 programs. So California, for example, has about 5 different PACE programs, and that number grows what it seems like month by month. What problems does commercial PACE solve? So a lot of the more traditional financing options, we quickly ran through what the positives and negatives of those are, but a lot of it is that it removes the barriers that have existed for building upgrade financing. It's hard to obtain capital for these types of projects. Traditional lenders aren't going to be as amenable to underwriting these types of projects. They're not going to be able to sort of comprehend or grasp what the risk analysis looks like on providing a 10-year note, for example, for a solar array, right? So you're held to working with ESCOs or working with equipment lease providers and things of that nature. And so commercial PACE, we're trying to position it just as another arrow in your quiver that you can present to your building owner, you can present to your tenants as a means of accomplishing the challenges that we went over earlier. So just to quickly run through a couple of the, a handful of the barriers and solutions that commercial PACE poses. So 100% of eligible project costs are financed up front. It's a no money down solution. So, you know, typically in a commercial mortgage loan, for example, you might put 10, 15, 20% down. Commercial pays 100% of eligible costs are financed up front. Okay. There's a tendency for only the low-hanging fruit in energy-related building improvement projects to get done, right? So, for example, an ESCO working with a large portfolio owner in Colorado is only going to do that business if it means a lot more business for them behind that, and if the project is relatively streamlined and they have a committed client. So you're really competing against the overall marketplace and the unwillingness for different types of lenders and equipment providers to be able to execute on projects that might not have the best credit or that might be a little bit esoteric in nature. So PACE effectively unlocks that by providing a credit enhancement to prospective property owners, because we're underwriting the property. Again, we're a tax assessment tied to the property, and by tying our money to a tax assessment, we can go out between 20 and 30 years at a fixed rate, which allows energy retrofits to become more economically viable because your payments are more serviceable because you're spreading them out over a longer period. It's an assessment, right? So it's not a traditional loan. And this is something that CleanFund is working with banks and appraisers alike, as well as property owners and channel partners, solar developers, to kind of educate the marketplace on the notion of tax assessment financing. So it's not a traditional loan. It attaches to the property, not to the borrower. It runs automatically to a new owner upon sale of a property, okay? And then, the split incentive issue is one that I'm sure you're all very aware of. We in our building deal with that as well because we want to make energy upgrades. But at the end of the day, we're not, if we were under a different lease structure, for example, we wouldn't necessarily be the ones paying for those upgrades, but we would absolutely be the ones procuring the benefits. So the split incentive issue is solved here because you have a situation whereby tenants are paying the property tax bill, especially under a triple net lease structure, for example, and they're also accruing the benefits, and it's effectively leaving the owner somewhat out of the transaction, which is helpful because the owner obviously wants to make his or her tenants happy, but he doesn't want to come out of pocket a great amount for those improvements. So this is a solution to the split incentive issue. Now moving on. So what can be financed? I began the slide deck by giving you guys sort of the large scope of solutions that exist out there, and they run the gamut. I'm sure you can all attest to the fact that there are a smattering of building solutions and probably a ton of people trying to sell them to you. PACE effectively captures almost 100% of all energy, water, and resiliency related building projects. Okay, so almost 100% of all of these types of building systems that have a positive impact on the building's NOI through a reduction in utilities are going to be eligible for CPACE because, again, its goal is to reduce carbon emissions in the built environment. I just wanted to give you guys a couple of case studies that I think will help to better set the stage and give you a reference point in terms of how it can be utilized in some specific use cases. So here are 3 case studies of projects we've closed in the recent past. Seton Medical Center, which was dubbed the Lady of 280 by some of the guys that run it, was under the strict California seismic mandate, which is even more stringent for hospitals. And we provided 100% of the upfront capital needed for Seton to do this seismic strengthening work. This was a very large project, the largest project that's been done by any commercial PACE capital provider in the nation that we know of. It was completed in 2017, and they've started the work. I think they're about 20 or so % done, It was a massive undertaking, but ultimately we allowed them to procure a lower cost of capital for an absolutely critical and necessary upgrade, not just because of law, but also because of safety. So the next case study was on a suburban office building in Boulder, Colorado. So a little bit of backstory on this one. Room 214 is a production studio that had been occupying the building for a couple years. And then they, essentially made enough money to purchase the building themselves, but they purchased it with a lot of deferred maintenance. So they saw that their utility bills were increasing month over month at an, a incredibly high rate, and they wanted to control those utility costs. And so what they did was a fairly holistic retrofit, actually. So they worked with a couple different subcontractors as well as an energy consulting firm to re-outfit their building with LEDs, with HVAC, with a new control system, an EV charging station for electric cars, a new roof, and a solar PV array. So the notion behind this sort of project, and this is certainly what CleanFund tries to capitalize on, is the reduce and produce sort of methodology, which is that you shouldn't necessarily just put solar on your roof. Rather, you should reduce the building's footprint first by putting things in like LEDs, which have a measurable month-over-month impact on utility savings, and then also couple that with a solar array, which is going to accrue a lot more savings than it otherwise would have if you just implemented a solar array with incandescent light bulbs, for example. And then the third project that I wanted to focus on, and this one is an interesting one because it was one of CleanFund's first projects, as well as really a proof of concept here for commercial PACE in California. And this was the Prologis headquarters in Pier 1. And this was in San Francisco here. And what Prologis wanted to do was reduce operating expenses by installing solar, meet corporate sustainability goals, and reserve their capital expenditure budget. PACE allowed for Prologis to accomplish all these goals. I believe the term we provided them was 20 years. So we did a 20-year fixed rate financing for a solar array and some energy related building improvements as well. And as I said, this in California was among the first proofs of concept for PACE. So it really helped to drive the industry forward and prove the case here in San Francisco and beyond. So just an overall, this is a slide that I just put in to kind of show you guys what the energy savings looked like and kind of how it was modeled, what the bottom line started at, and where we got to. Breezing through here, overall impact of PACE, I just threw this in because, again, it's a little bit of a new dynamic where you're reducing your electricity bill at the expense of increasing your property tax bill. And then the income reduction is actually just a write-off of your interest expense as you would do so for a mortgage. So communicating value. This is one of the pivotal portions of this presentation because you, the facilities managers, are tasked with trying to understand who the different parties are, what are the different challenges that they're facing, and what can you communicate back to them to allow them to understand where you're coming from and what you think the best path forward is. So of course, how do you sell your vision, right? So you can sell it on project cash flows. So emphasis is always on boosting net operating income. Doesn't really matter who you're talking to, whether it be a tenant or an owner. If you're reducing utilities, then you're having a positive impact on the building's net operating income, and you are having a measurable effect on both the environment as well as all the businesses that might sort of correlate to that. Sell it as a means of aligning owners and tenants, right? So this was that split incentive issue that we spoke about. So the ability to share the repayment regardless of the financing mechanism enables owners to have a stake in the improvements. So owners are both, the owner of the building as well as kind of the overseer of the overall project in a sense. And tenants are the ones who are obtaining the benefit, and by allowing for them to also pay for that benefit, but also having a positive impact on NOI, you're going to be able to accomplish that sale a lot easier. sell it on net present value, right? So everybody is interested in investment and how they're going to get the most bang for their buck now. So a lot of the contractors and energy audit firms that you work with probably have a sort of plethora of solutions out there that can help you to derive what the MPV is going to be on a specific energy related building project. So I urge you to work with them. I assure you they have the tools, the product spec sheets, the data sheets to show you exactly what your savings are going to be over the term for whatever type of financing you choose. And then what the NPV is going to be from day one for the property owner. And then also, selling it as an expansion of credit, right? So if you're financing a capital improvement project, if you're taking out money from a third-party provider to do a central plant upgrade, that means that you're preserving that money for necessary building operations. And that obviously has a measurable impact on the bottom line for a building owner, because they want to know, how they can grow the business. How can they buy another property, or how can they invest in another type of business that they're operating? So expansion of credit, I think, is a huge one. Final takeaways, I think to wrap it up, it's certainly not easy. I think we can all attest that few things in life are easy that are worth doing, but it's definitely possible. And with innovations in energy systems and financial technologies that just seem to be coming out from partners that we work with and from our competitors, it's becoming affordable and more commonplace to get our built environment to operate incrementally more efficiently. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A now. Also feel free to reach out directly to me if you want to learn more about CleanFund or Commercial PACE. We have a lot of different types of tools available these days, from online systems to energy modeling for solar arrays, if you're interested in doing those types of projects. So I thank you all for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great. As a reminder, please raise your hand if you have a question, or you can type your question in the questions box. If you would like to be unmuted, we can definitely do that as well, so that you can present your question to the group. Looks like we've got some questions already coming in. This question is from Chris. Can you benefit from PACE if self-financing project, or if it's a self-financing project or a loan from an outside lender required? So they're asking, is it self-financing or is a loan required from a third-party lender?
So PACE is we like to stray away from the word loan, but it effectively is a private capital provider like CleanFund, providing you the upfront capital needed to do the project. So we are lending money for these vital energy improvements. I do want to stress, though, that although it is a public-private partnership and we're funding these projects through public means, it's 100% private capital. So it's not taxpayer money. It's a group of capital providers that CleanFund works with to provide the capital for these building improvements.
Danny, this is Dean. I'm just going to jump in on that one too, because what I want to stress, and you mentioned it earlier, but I think what people don't often understand is that the financing is not held against the owner; it's against the property itself. So when you mentioned that, if they sell the property, it goes along with the property to the next owner. That means there's really no debt on the books for the owner. You don't have a liability there. You have a property tax bill, which you had anyway, and it's just going to be slightly different. I think to build on that discussion too, that I think most facility managers run into when you're competing for internal capital funding every year. Most companies have one bucket of capital that they're allocating against infrastructure, as well as the revenue generating side of the business. So if you're going in asking for money for infrastructure and you're competing against those people that are going to generate additional revenue for the company, you're kind of starting off with a liability there, because obviously they're going to look at that stuff first. Some companies may divvy up their capital, so they'll take a certain amount of money and say this is for infrastructure projects, and then you compete with IT and anybody else, HR, anybody who's trying to get some other infrastructure work done. But at least then you have a better chance of building a case that says this is what we need and here are the risks for not doing it. Whereas when you're competing against somebody who's generating revenue for the company, it's hard to come up with an argument that says, well, this might happen if we don't upgrade this chiller. As opposed to if we do this project, we will generate more money and more revenue. So anyway, thanks, Danny. I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Dean.
Okay. A couple of follow-up questions to that. What types of percentage rates are you seeing, and is this available in New York City?
It depends on the size of the project. So generally speaking, the larger the project, the lower the interest rate. I can tell you that for $1 million project, for example, we're going to be in the low 6s right now. But generally speaking, you're going to see interest rates anywhere between 5.5 to 7. And on the New York City question, PACE as a legislative act is available in New York City, but there are some complications associated with the statute itself. So we expect that a real go live date for commercial PACE really as a whole is going to happen probably Q4 2018. And that is going to be a huge opportunity for commercial PACE providers, obviously, because it has one of the oldest and biggest building stocks in the nation, probably in the world.
Okay. Vanessa asks, what's the one-sentence response to why CPACE is still a great financing option if the owner of the building gets hung up on the higher property taxes?
The long-term fixed rate nature of the capital is going to allow you to accrue benefits that you won't otherwise be able to through other forms of financing.
Okay. Eric asked, I noticed that Washington State is not included as a state where PACE is available. Is there progress for PACE legislation in Washington?
That's a great question. Washington is my home state, so I assure you we are fighting hard. They have began the process of adopting the statute in Washington. So we're working with the governor and state legislators to write the legislation such that it's most amenable to property owners and investors alike. So we're hoping, these things can obviously take a long time, but we're hoping that it'll probably be around a Q1 2019 movement.
Okay. And it looks like we have a hand raised. Thomas, your mic is unmuted. Let's see. Trying to unmute you. Looks like you self-muted. Okay, how about now, Thomas? Try now. Thomas, are you there?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
I would just ask, because my understanding in the past, even though it's on the property taxes, the banks have required that they be paid off. Is that still true, or is it just case by case?
Yeah, good question, Thomas. So one of the major subjects that I didn't broach here, but I urge you guys to ask me questions or follow up with me separately after the presentation, is that commercial PACE by law is required to obtain written consent for all secured lien holders. So that means that CleanFund on each and every project in which we have a active mortgage lender are working with that mortgage lender in order to obtain their written approval for the transaction. So specifically to your question, Thomas, PACE is such a new product that preliminary market data is telling us that PACE assessments are not required to be paid off by mortgage lenders. So a new buyer's mortgage lender steps in and they are just including that essentially expense item as a potential debt payoff, which lowers the sales of the proceeds sales to the seller. I will say we've seen about 7 or 8 of these transactions take place, and in almost every case, the PACE assessment has not been paid off. We are hearing, though, in working with lenders, that some of them are going to require the payoff. But as I said, it doesn't have a residual impact on the property's value because it can be paid off at any time. So although it might impact the sales proceeds to the seller, it's not going to have a residual impact on the property's value because once it's paid off, it's done.
Okay. We have another question that just came in. If there are local rebates for energy upgrades, who takes advantage of the rebate?
Yeah, great question. CleanFund is not, and I don't know of any commercial PACE capital provider that is taking advantage of the rebates. So the rebates go to the customer, and we can shave off those rebates. Well, it depends if it's a grant or a rebate. But taking the example of a grant, if there's a grant associated with the solar PV project or something like that, then those grants are shaved off the top of the project cost, and we're only financing the project cost less the grants. In the case of a rebate, the owners are taking 100% of all rebates associated with the projects, as well as tax credits.
Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the questions portal. If you are logged on via phone, be sure to attach your PIN so that we can unmute you so that you can ask a question if you need to. Otherwise, you can always reach out to Danny via email. His information is included. We'll just wait another moment to see if there are any other questions. Okay, it looks like we have Thomas with a follow-up question. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, he pretty much answered the question. It sounds like it's optional when they buy the new building whether they would pay off the PACE or not. But when you do the PACE, it doesn't affect them. It's only if the new owner is purchasing, he might have to pay that off. So he answered that question, so thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, looks like we've got another hand up. Bird, you've been unmuted. Go ahead. Bird, do you still have a question, or was your question answered as well? Okay, looks like that question was answered. All right, so I don't see any other questions or hands raised. Okay, here's a hand. Bird, go ahead. You're available. You're unmuted. Okay. That doesn't look like Bird has a mic. Feel free to type in your question if you like. Otherwise, Danny's information will be available on the presentation information, so you can definitely consult it there. We'll also provide you with the handouts and a recording of this message if you would like to review or share it with someone in your industry that could benefit from this as well. The question is, this sounds like a great win-win situation. Who are the investors typically?
It depends what side of the project you're talking about. So on our side, we work with a number of different capital providers that provide the capital for the project. So that would be things like life insurance companies and asset management firms. And then on, the project investment side on a specific basis, a couple of examples would be, for example, Prologis. So that's a very large industrial commercial real estate owner. So that's a portfolio owner that is interested in obtaining corporate sustainability goals. Those are certainly a primary client of CleanFund's, as well as in the case of that Room 214 project in Boulder, we work with a lot of owner-occupied properties and sort of single tenant properties that run the gamut all sorts of types of different commercial real estate. So to really narrow our project basis down into a few buckets is difficult, because I think the point of commercial PACE really is to offer this product and to remove the barriers to building owners that have vital building requirements, and to kind of open up the landscape to see who needs financing and try to obtain it for them. So I think that our investor pool, or our sort of customer pool, is very, very, very broad.
Okay. We have another question. This one's from Joe. Do solar renewable energy credits also get applied to pay down the PACE loan over time?
Yeah, great question, Joe. So yes, we have a couple of different products on the solar side. If the owner is wanting to enter into what we call a direct ownership model, so if they're just taking out a PACE assessment to provide the upfront capital needed to do the solar PV array, they are obtaining 100% of all tax credits and makers depreciation associated with that project, and they can utilize those tax credits, the ITC for example, to pay down the assessment in future years if they so choose. So that's one structure of a product that we offer. And then a second product would be what we call a prepaid PPA deposit project, and that would be where we bring in a third-party tax equity provider to offer a PPA structure to the building owner in exchange for harvesting the tax benefits of the ITC and the maker's depreciation associated with the solar PV array. So the building owner, just for a very simple example, let's say the solar array costs $100, the tax equity provider would provide $20 in equity to the project, which would mean that the building owner would finance only $80 of the project. In exchange, the tax equity provider harvests the ITC and the maker's depreciation. Okay, so it makes it less costly for the building owner, and for the tax equity provider, they get a nice tax credit.
Okay. A follow-up question from Joe was, is Illinois a state where PACE is available? Also, is Wisconsin?
Good questions, Joe. So Illinois, we're hoping is going to become, so they did draft a statute, but it was unfortunately not adopted by any PACE providers that we're aware of. So they've gone back to the drawing board with local legislators to amend the statute such that it meets the requirements of building owners and capital providers. Like Wisconsin is absolutely live. They have a live PACE program, and I'd be happy to connect you with the guys over there if you would like. So let me know.
Okay. Also, in the case of CPACE with triple net tenants, do you see pushback from landlords when PACE term is longer than the lease term?
That's a good question. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and I would say that generally speaking, yes. Triple net tenants and the split incentive issue continues to be a problem, although we certainly have a solution. I think it's better than any other solution that's specifically for these types of building improvements. You are effectively still asking the owner to take on some form of an obligation, because at the end of the day, they are underlying, the underlying ownership of the property. So if you have a lease that's less, not as long as a PACE term, then you might have a gap there whereby the owner is effectively responsible for that gap. And we have worked with building owners and tenants to amend leases such that it meets everybody's needs. And that's absolutely a service that we can offer, because we realize that's an important component of the project, right?
Okay, another question. Is there any problem with SBA loans and compatibility?
That is a timely question. So CleanFund, actually I believe the Boulder, Colorado project was an SBA loan, a 504. We've had great success with 504 loans because it stacks quite nicely up, because building owners are able to get a high degree of leverage with SBA loans, obviously, but there might be a high degree of deferred maintenance on their properties, typically owner-occupied properties running businesses, right, or single and multi-tenant properties. So we found that our capital is a perfect fit for those types of projects. However, the SBA actually just issued guidance in March, I believe, of this year that said on 504 loans, they are going back to the drawing board as it relates to providing consents on CPACE assessments. So what that means essentially in a nutshell is that our vice president of credit is going out to the DC office to figure out how we can get this moving again. And SBA did that because they see themselves as taking a third now on these types of projects because as you may know, on an SBA loan, they're guaranteeing a portion, on an SBA 504, they're guaranteeing a portion of the loan. And then the community bank that facilitated the loan origination is taking the first, SBA is taking the second piece. And because PACE would be layered into the overall capital stack with a single year's assessment sitting in front of the first, the SBA sees on the 504 program that as them taking a third position. So in a nutshell, what that means is we need to go back to the drawing board to renegotiate.
Okay. Do you fund nonprofits with PPA?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we've worked on, I want to say 4 nonprofits in California, and we are about to close our first nonprofits on a independent private school in Missouri. And a couple of those have been PPAs. So we've done absolutely nonprofit PPA solar improvement projects.
Hey, Danny, this is Dean. I'm going to pose a question for you regarding PACE and new construction, because I know there's been some innovative things that people have been doing to utilize PACE to bring down some of the construction cost or debt.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Dean. So PACE was birthed with the idea of providing capital for energy retrofits with existing stabilized properties. But it has quickly been utilized for real estate developers and incorporated in overall capital stacks. And what we're seeing is PACE is a less expensive alternative to mezzanine or preferred equity, and is effectively gap financing that allows owners to take out long-term fixed rate capital that can provide the gap they need between their senior construction loan and their equity. So typically speaking, especially in this current market environment, you're having senior construction lenders lending out approximately 60 or 65% on a loan to cost basis, with that remaining 40 or 35% being derived of a mixture of sponsor equity, so equity provided by the developer, and then mezzanine financing, and then preferred equity. And what we're seeing is PACE is either filling a gap between preferred equity and equity, or just taking up the whole piece of the mezzanine and preferred equity stack. And again, you know, this is something I didn't touch on in the presentation because I didn't go into too much specifics, but we can finance up to 20% of the property's value. So we can effectively provide somewhere around 20% of the overall capital stack on a project.
Okay. Well, it looks like those are all of our questions here. Dean, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, just a couple of closing comments here. So thanks everybody for all the questions. There was probably more questions here than I've heard in a long time with a webinar. So it's a good thing that Danny got finished a little early. But as you can see, and just hearing some of the conversation, the complexities of financing is something that the typical facility manager doesn't deal with on a daily basis. So walking into a CFO's office and starting to present some of this stuff, you quickly get sort of overrun with a lot of the questions that you don't have the the ability to answer, or that you don't have those answers in your hip pocket. My own company, we partner with CleanFund, and part of the reason for that is that if we're sitting down in front of an owner that we're proposing some energy efficiency projects and some means to finance it, we really need to have someone with that expertise that can walk through the nuances of all of these, funding scenarios. And, why would a CFO choose to, use PACE financing versus their own internal capital, or going out and getting a loan that they feel they may be able to get at a lower rate. There's lots of issues around that. And like I said, unless you're in the C-suite or deal with finance on a regular basis, you probably don't have the insights on all of those, decision-making criteria. So just something to keep in mind, when you get down the road here, it's a good idea to maybe reach out to a partner that can help explain some of those things, put together that information so that you're well armed in having that discussion with, the finance folks. Also, if you want to go back, the May-June 2017 issue of FMJ, I actually wrote an article on PACE, so it was really more of a broad explanation of PACE and where it was available at the time. So that's back in the May-June 2017 issue, if you want to, refer back to that. And if there's no more questions, I think we will give you about 2 minutes back of your hour.
Thank you so much, Dean. And again, this information will be sent to you tomorrow afternoon. You'll have the recording and the slides for you to share with your colleagues. In the meantime, everyone have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you.